today's lesson, we are going to be looking at the introduction to data. So this is going to be our first lesson in the second half of the course, where we're making that switch from probability to more data management, looking at statistics. So it is going to be a little bit of a switch in terms of what content we're going to be learning. This first unit is going to be mostly a lot of terms, a lot of definitions, a lot of kind of practices or concepts rather than actual calculations like we've been used to. So as a warm-up, you can find this article either in the online platform or just by searching it for the CBC, but I want you to read the article on the 7 Canadian snacks you can't get in the US and the backstory on why. And then as you're reading it, I want you to ask or think about the question, how are statistics used to make decisions as to what products companies sell or don't sell? So you probably are aware that there are only certain snacks that are inherently Canadian because you can only get them in Canada. You can't get them in the US. Right? Ketchup chips are a big one. And there are other things like Coffee Crisp, I believe Kinder Eggs, Smarties, things like that. So read through the article and then think about how you think companies use statistics to make the decisions on what to sell or what not to sell, because that's going to be kind of the idea of what we're looking at in this unit and this half of the course is how do we use statistics or calculating statistics that we can then use. Moving into some of the terminology that we're going to be working with. First one we have is primary versus secondary data. So primary data is basically a study that we conduct on our own. Essentially, it is data that we collect ourselves. So if we are collecting the data ourselves personally through experiments or studies, it's considered primary data. The opposite is secondary data. And secondary data is collected, organized, and analyzed by someone other than ourselves. Right? So this would be someone else is collecting the data, someone else is finding the different statistics on it, or they're organizing that data in a specific way, right? So we then have to ask ourselves if we trust the source and question if the source has made sure the data is valid and reliable, right? So it's okay to use data that you haven't collected yourself because obviously time constraints, money constraints, or financial constraints, or things like that, you may not be able to collect the data on your own. So it's okay to use secondary data, but we have to make sure that the source that we're using is trusted. So a big or a good trusted secondary source would be Statistics Canada, right? Because they are responsible for gathering data on Canadians, not looking at anything, but they're just gathering data. So they're looking at either the census surveys that they send out every so often, or just various different parts or different aspects of Canada itself. They're looking at data, they're collecting data, they're organizing it, they're putting it into tables, they're grouping it by provinces and territories or cities and things like that. So the Statistics Canada is a trusted secondary source, right? It is valid, it is reliable. You can make the argument about whether the government is inherently doing something with the data and whatnot, but they're presenting the data and they tell you how they found it, who they talked to, not specifically, but what individuals or what populations or what samples. They list all of that in their data. So that's how we can say that it's a trusted source, because we know the methodology behind where they got the data. Right? So you can visit a couple things, right? You can look at the 2016 census section, read through some of the sections, summarize if there's any important findings. Right? There's you can look at the Spotlight on Canadians and read through certain sections just to see what there is. So I do recommend taking a look at Statistics Canada to find, just to see what's available, what data is out there. Another terminology we're going to be looking at is population versus sample. So a population is a collection of people stated as specifically in terms of location, and demographic traits as a study desires. Right? So a population is a collection of people that we're stating as specifically in terms of location and traits as we need. Right? So for example, the population that we're looking at, maybe we're looking at something, we're trying to make observations on secondary students in the world, or secondary students in North America, or secondary students in Canada, or secondary students in Ontario, right? Yes, there's smaller and smaller groups, but it depends on what I want my population to be, or what I want my observations to be about, or what I want the observations to be related to or applied to. So the larger the population, the more difficult it can be to generalize a conclusion. Right? If you think about yourself as a secondary student in Ontario, right, you might be able to make some generalizations about that population. Everyone in Ontario is essentially following somewhat of the same curriculum, right? Same kind of funding if you're all in public schools. Right? Obviously, locations differ within Ontario, but generally speaking, you might be able to make a generalization about secondary students. Now, when you look at Canada, now you're adding in the different provinces, the different territories. So there's other factors that are going to come into play. So you might still be able to make that generalization that you're all in Canada. There's certain freedoms and rights that every individual would have that would make things kind of similar. But you look at different curriculums now, different lifestyles, depending on where you live and things like that. So it makes it harder to generalize. When you move into North America, it's even harder because now you're adding in the United States and Mexico, right? Different curriculums, different countries, different governments, different states, provinces. A lot more variables come into play, and even more so when you now include the world, right? So if you're trying to make or apply a finding or an observation to a population, right, the larger the population you're looking at, the harder it's going to be to make that generalization or to make that statement that says all secondary students, whatever the statement tends to be. Right, so the larger the population, the more difficult it can be to generalize. When looking at a sample is a collection of a smaller group of people from the population. Right? So if we're making if we're looking at the population of Ontario for secondary students and we want to make observations or generalizations for those students, we're not going to be able to ask every secondary student. Right? It would take a lot of time and a lot of resources to do that, and it's not feasible. It's not realistic. So instead of looking at the population, we look at a sample, which is a collection of which is a smaller group of people from that target population. Now, ideally, you want the sample to represent the population. So in terms of demographics, makeup, things like that, you want to make sure the sample represents the target population. So if I'm looking at secondary students in Ontario, maybe I ask secondary students within a certain school board or a couple schools in Ontario. Things like that. So it's not everyone, it's a smaller, more manageable group. When we look at the data, we talked a little bit about when we're gathering, especially secondary data, we talked about we want to make sure that it's a trusted source. We want to make sure there's certain things about that data. Right? Variability is one of those things that we might want to look at. And variability is the extent to which samples, data, and the corresponding conclusions are different from study to study. So if we're looking at data and if there's a lot of variability, then that means there's a lack of consistency, right? It's not the same from study to study. We want there to be low variability, right? So we maybe might want to add that in. You want low variability. Because the idea is that if you're making a conclusion about a certain population, whatever the case may be, you want to make sure that if someone else does that study, that they get the same thing using that data. Right? If they're using the data and getting a different conclusion, then there's a lot of there's variability there. Right? It means it's not consistent from study to study. It's not consistent, so that argument that you're trying to make, that generalization, isn't going to be as strong. And the variability could be caused by bias, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about the different types of bias later. But bias, either whether it's intentional or unintentional, could affect the variability. In order to help reduce the variability and increase that consistency, we want to look at reliability and validity. Right? So these are two factors or two things to think about. Reliability is the extent to which, if a study was done over and over again, it would yield the same results. So basically, your data, your observations, your conclusions, it's reliable, right? I can trust that if I do it again, I would get the same results. If you're having different or many studies come up with differing results every time, it's not reliable, right? So your argument, your conclusions aren't reliable because not everyone will be able to get that same result. Validity, the second part, is the extent to which the conclusions represent the population that they claim to represent. So are your conclusions valid? Right? I'm not going to take conclusions for looking at students in a local high school and apply it to students in another province or in another country. It might be even hard to say there would be a little bit a lack of validity if I take the results from one high school and try to apply it to another. Right? If I look at maybe what do you feel is important in high schools, and I take it and apply it to a high school in a different city, there might be some varying validity there because it's two different schools. Right? So again, depending on what we're looking at, depending on our conclusions, we do want to look at the validity as well. How well do our claims represent the population that we're making the observations about or the generalizations about? So, for example, to look at that, I want you to read through the CIBC news article on sausages containing different types of meat. Again, you can find it in the online platform, or you can research it and discuss the questions that need to be asked to determine if the study was valid and reliable. So read through it and think about what should we be asking. If we could ask the people that did the study, what are some things that we should ask to ensure that it's valid and it's reliable? So this can vary. This can vary from person. This can vary. You might not get the same answers as someone else, but I want you to think about those questions because that's what you should be thinking about anytime you're reading an article, right? How valid and how reliable is what they're telling us? It might be, right? But again, I think we see a lot of it lately with so much information that's out there. You really have to take a second and think about what is being told to you, right? Whether it's by a news agency, whether it's by something you see on Twitter or Instagram or TikTok, things that are posted. You really have to think about first before you start repeating that information or really listening to it. You want to make sure you ask these types of questions, right, to really think about it. And then once you're done reading that article, there are more articles in D2L to really think about. So pick one, read through it, think about is it primary or secondary data? What are the conclusions? What is the population that is impacted by the statistics or by the generalizations or conclusions? Is the sample representative, right? Is the sample representative of the population? And then what do the findings mean to you in your life, right? Does it mean anything to you? Can you take something out of what's being told to you? That type of thing. So again, like I said, this course this half of the course is going to be a little bit different, right? You can see we're already done our lesson. No calculations done whatsoever, but a lot more theories and terms and concepts than what we've previously looked at. So again, make sure you are trying to go through and reading these articles, doing these kind of investigations, asking these questions, because that's kind of what you're going to be doing rather than just entering calculations or coming up or using formulas and things like that, at least for this unit.